Most wedding vows promise loyalty through sickness and health. On their wedding night, Kelly and Jason Cochran forged a vastly different kind of promise. A solemn blood pact binding them to murder anyone who dared to interfere with their marriage. For over a decade, this morbid covenant lay dormant in the shadows, until the freezing silence of an isolated Michigan neighborhood was violently shattered by a single, deafening gunshot inside an otherwise ordinary home. The trap had finally been sprung. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Merrillville, Indiana is a sprawling industrial hub roughly 40 miles southeast of Chicago. It was here that Kelly Marie Gaboyan and Jason Cochran first crossed paths as teenagers in the late 1990s. From the outside, they appeared to be a standard Midwestern pair, but the internal architecture of their relationship was built on a deeply uneven, parasitic foundation. Kelly possessed an intense, calculating intelligence. Former classmates and teachers recalled a young woman who was always observing, always analyzing the psychological weak points of those around her. She didn't just want companionship, she required absolute, unquestioned dominance. Acquaintances noted to investigators that Kelly frequently steered conversations to highlight her own superiority, ensuring everyone in the room understood she operated on a higher intellectual plane. She viewed people not as peers, but as utility objects to be arranged according to her immediate needs. Jason was entirely pliant. He was a quiet, unassuming young man who sought firm direction and found it in Kelly's overwhelming personality. By the time they married in 2002, the power dynamic was permanently cemented. Their union was not a partnership of equals. It was a psychological annexation. Jason surrendered his autonomy completely, allowing his new wife to dictate their finances, their social circle, and eventually their entire moral compass. As the years progressed, Jason's physical health began to aggressively mirror his psychological submission. He developed severe, chronic back pain that radiated down his spine, eventually requiring multiple invasive surgeries. The physical deterioration left him largely incapacitated. He spent most of his days confined to the house, his world shrinking to the square footage of their living room and the immediate demands of his wife. As his physical strength waned, his dependency on Kelly transformed into a desperate, clinging obedience. Kelly weaponized this physical vulnerability. She methodically isolated Jason from his extended family in Indiana, ensuring she was his sole provider and his only link to the outside world. She managed his daily medication schedule, effectively turning relief from excruciating pain into a conditioned reward for total compliance. Relatives later reported that Jason seemed visibly terrified of upsetting his wife, carefully monitoring her facial expressions before answering simple questions. He had become a hostage in his own marriage, bound by a twisted sense of loyalty and a complete inability to function independently. Despite his daily suffering, Jason worshipped the ground Kelly walked on. He interpreted her tyrannical control as a form of profound, fierce love. For Kelly, Jason was the perfect vessel. He was a man who would never challenge her authority, never attempt to leave, and, most importantly, never refuse a command. This absolute blind submission laid the groundwork for the grotesque vow they made on their wedding night. The pact to eliminate anyone who threatened their bond was not a mutual agreement forged in romantic passion. It was a loyalty test designed by Kelly, a dark, abstract hypothetical that she slowly, patiently shaped into an actionable protocol. They existed in this isolated, toxic ecosystem for over a decade. The couple eventually decided to leave the industrial sprawl of Indiana, seeking a drastic change in scenery. But a shift in geography could not cure the rot at the core of their relationship. The impending move would only serve to heighten their isolation, pushing them further away from any remaining social tethers and placing them directly on a collision course with the pact's first target. In 2013, the Cochrans severed their final ties to Indiana and drove nearly 400 miles north, crossing into the remote expanse of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. They settled in Caspian, a decaying mining village pressed hard against the borders of Iron River. This was a landscape defined by its hostility. For 6 months of the year, the region was buried under feet of lake-effect snow, with winter temperatures routinely plunging far below 0 Fahrenheit. The dense, suffocating canopy of the Ottawa National Forest surrounded the town, offering absolute isolation. It was the perfect environment for a predator to operate without observation. They purchased an old, weathered house on a quiet street. For Jason, the relocation changed nothing. His chronic spinal degradation kept him trapped indoors, his physical world remaining completely static. He sat in the dimly lit living room, heavily medicated and entirely dependent on his wife for his basic survival needs. Kelly, however, thrived in the new environment. She required external stimulation and an audience to manipulate. To satisfy this need, she secured a position at a local heavy machinery manufacturing plant. It was within the metallic, deafening confines of this factory floor that she identified her next utility object, a colleague named Christopher Regan. At 53, Chris was the absolute antithesis of Jason Cochran. He was a United States Air Force veteran who maintained peak physical condition, running several miles a day regardless of the freezing Michigan weather. He was robust, outgoing, and widely respected by his coworkers. Chris was also a man in transition. He had recently finalized plans to leave the brutal northern winters behind and relocate to Asheville, North Carolina, seeking a fresh start. He was single, confident, and possessed an easy charm, making him an irresistible target for Kelly's psychological games. She initiated the contact. Kelly began shadowing Chris at the factory, studying his routines and identifying his emotional blind spots. She skillfully adopted the persona of a fragile, trapped woman. She fed Chris a fabricated narrative of domestic abuse, portraying Jason as a volatile monster and herself as a desperate victim seeking a momentary escape. Chris, possessing a natural protective instinct honed by his military background, fell directly into the trap. The professional boundary dissolved, and Kelly successfully initiated a clandestine sexual affair. For Chris, the relationship was an insignificant physical entanglement, a brief diversion before his impending move down south. He kept his bags packed in his apartment, completely unaware that he was being woven into a fatal domestic protocol. Kelly had no intention of keeping the affair a secret. Secrecy offered no psychological leverage. She wanted the collision. She deliberately began leaving digital breadcrumbs for Jason to find, ensuring he would discover the infidelity. When he inevitably confronted her, Kelly did not apologize. Instead, she weaponized the betrayal. She explicitly detailed Chris's physical superiority, using the older man's fitness as a blunt instrument to batter Jason's already fragile ego. She forced her husband to visualize the intimacy she shared with a healthy, capable man. The manipulation achieved its exact intended effect. Jason's reaction was not to demand a divorce or leave the house. His pathological terror of abandonment fused with a sudden, violent surge of jealousy. His submission morphed into a desperate need to eliminate the competition and reclaim his wife's undivided attention. It was at this precise juncture that Kelly casually reintroduced the concept of their wedding night vow. The abstract promise to destroy anyone who interfered with their marriage was no longer a theoretical exercise. Kelly had painstakingly built a real-world scenario to test it. She had presented the threat, and now she demanded that Jason fulfill his end of the bargain to prove his absolute loyalty. The dynamic in the Caspian house shifted from toxic stagnation to active, lethal planning. They began mapping out the logistics of a murder. They inventoried the tools in their garage, noting which instruments could easily sever bone and tissue. They analyzed the structural layout of their own basement, identifying the areas where sound would be muffled by the earth. They purchased heavy-duty plastic sheeting, industrial cleaning supplies, and reciprocating saw blades. Every step of the preparation was a shared activity. Kelly directed the methodology, while Jason, driven by a toxic cocktail of obedience and jealousy, complied with every instruction. The freezing Michigan woods outside their windows provided the ultimate disposal site. They had millions of acres of untamed wilderness at their disposal, populated by black bears and coyotes capable of erasing biological evidence within days. Chris Regan continued his daily runs through the snow, finalized his moving arrangements, and occasionally visited Kelly, completely blind to the fact that he was no longer a lover. He had been reclassified as a target. The trap was fully constructed. All Kelly had to do was invite him inside. October 14th, 2014, arrived with the bitter, damp cold typical of late autumn in the Upper Peninsula. Outside the house in Caspian, the temperature hovered in the low 40s Fahrenheit, freezing the muddy topsoil into a rigid crust. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, suffocating anticipation. Kelly had meticulously staged the environment. The living room was softly lit, projecting an aura of domestic tranquility. Down below, separated by a few inches of wood and aging linoleum, the basement had been transformed into a sterile, industrial processing zone. Heavy 6mm plastic sheeting covered the concrete floor, taped securely up the cinder block walls. Industrial cleaning agents, bleach, ammonia, and heavy-duty degreasers were stacked neatly on a wooden workbench. A reciprocating saw, fitted with a fresh, fine-toothed blade designed for cutting through dense materials, sat plugged into the wall, its cord neatly coiled. Jason Cochran positioned himself in the shadows at the top of the basement stairs. His chronic back pain, a constant, agonizing companion that usually kept him glued to the living room couch, was temporarily overridden by a massive surge of adrenaline. He held a .22 caliber rifle, his hands gripping the cold steel with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. He waited in absolute silence. His breathing was shallow. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the wind pressing against the siding of the old house. He was fulfilling his purpose. He was finally proving his absolute worth to the only person who tethered him to reality. Kelly stood in the kitchen, her demeanor entirely detached and analytical. She had sent the final text message to Christopher Regan earlier that afternoon, inviting him over for dinner and a quiet evening. She had assured him that her husband would be out of the house. It was a simple, mundane invitation. Chris, entirely unaware of the shifting dynamics and his new classification as a target, accepted. He had just finished his daily evening run. He was in prime physical condition, weighing roughly 185 pounds of solid, maintained muscle. He drove his vehicle through the quiet, snow-dusted streets of the mining village, pulling into the driveway of the weathered house just after dusk. The heavy wooden front door creaked open. Chris stepped inside, stamping the cold mud from his boots. He brought with him the sharp, ozone scent of the freezing Michigan air. He moved into the kitchen, his posture relaxed, his guard completely lowered by months of intimate familiarity. Kelly greeted him with a practiced, hollow warmth. She offered him food. She offered him a drink. She moved around the space with a slow, deliberate rhythm, silently guiding him deeper into the house, steering him closer to the narrow hallway that led past the basement door. They transitioned toward the living area. The timing had to be precise. Kelly paused, stepping slightly to the side to clear the firing line. It was a physical cue. The basement door swung open. Jason emerged from the darkness. He did not yell. He did not issue a warning. The confrontation Kelly had engineered required no preamble. The psychological conditioning of the past decade culminated in this singular fraction of a second. Chris barely had time to register the man standing in the doorway. He turned his head, the confusion just beginning to form on his features. A single shot ruptured the quiet house. The sound was deafening, bouncing violently off the low ceilings. The .22 caliber bullet struck Chris Regan squarely in the back of the head. His body went entirely rigid. The kinetic energy of the projectile instantly neutralized his central nervous system. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds. The physically superior, military-trained athlete collapsed onto the floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The harsh scent of burnt gunpowder instantly overpowered the smell of the kitchen. A thick, dark pool began to expand rapidly across the floorboards. Silence slammed back into the house. Jason stood frozen, the rifle still raised, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to rapidly recede, replaced instantly by the agonizing, burning sensation radiating down his damaged spine. He looked at his wife. Kelly did not scream. She did not panic. She looked down at the lifeless body of her former lover, her face a mask of absolute, chilling indifference. The pact was sealed. The test of loyalty was complete. Jason had proven his submission with blood. Now, the brutal logistics of disposal commenced. They had millions of acres of dense national forest waiting outside, but they could not move a 185-pound man in one piece. The structural layout of the house mandated the next horrific phase. Jason, fighting through the returning waves of physical agony, grabbed Chris by the ankles. Kelly grabbed his arms. Together, they dragged the dead weight across the living room. The friction of heavy winter clothing against the floor created a dull, rhythmic scratching sound. They reached the basement threshold. They maneuvered the body down the narrow wooden stairs. Gravity did most of the work, the torso thumping heavily against each step, leaving a grim, smeared trail in its wake. The descent felt endlessly long. The physical exertion was immense, stripping away any remaining energy and leaving Jason gasping for air in the damp, subterranean chill. The basement was freezing. The concrete walls trapped the dropping temperature. The harsh fluorescent lighting buzzed erratically overhead, illuminating the plastic-covered floor. They positioned Chris in the center of the sheeting. The psychological detachment required for this phase was absolute. Kelly took the lead, functioning with the cold efficiency of a butcher processing livestock. She instructed Jason to retrieve the reciprocating saw. The harsh, mechanical scream of the power tool tore through the basement. The noise was violent, a rapid, tearing sound that echoed off the cinder blocks, completely muffled from the outside world by the surrounding earth. They worked methodically. The saw blade bit through thick denim, skin, dense muscle tissue, and heavy bone. The vibration of the tool numbed their hands, sending shockwaves up their arms. Blood and biological debris scattered in a violent radius, caught entirely by the plastic barriers. The metallic, heavy scent of iron mixed with the sharp chemical odor of the degreasers. It was grueling, physical labor. Jason's back spasms intensified, forcing him to take frequent breaks, leaning heavily against the wooden workbench while Kelly continued the gruesome task without hesitation. They severed the limbs. They decapitated the torso. The robust, capable body of the Air Force veteran was systematically dismantled into unrecognizable, manageable pieces. Kelly meticulously separated the remains, placing the severed sections into heavy-duty, black industrial trash bags. She double-bagged them, expelling the air before securing the tops tightly with thick silver duct tape, wrapping it multiple times to ensure an airtight seal against the fluids and the impending decay. Hours ticked by. The physical toll was immense, yet the focus remained unbroken. Once the remains were fully packaged into 15 separate heavy bags, the decontamination process began. They scrubbed the reciprocating saw, destroying the used blades. They gathered the soiled plastic sheeting, folding it inward to trap the biological evidence. They poured gallons of bleach over the concrete, the caustic fumes burning their eyes and throats, erasing the visual and olfactory footprint of the carnage. By dawn, the house in Caspian was quiet again. The floors upstairs were scrubbed raw. The basement smelled strictly of industrial chemicals. The 15 black bags sat lined up against the cold foundation wall, waiting for transport. Outside, the freezing town of Iron River slowly woke up, completely oblivious to the fact that beneath the roof of an ordinary home, a human being had been mechanically erased from existence. The machinery at the manufacturing plant roared to life the next morning, but a noticeable void existed on the factory floor. The missing man was defined by his extreme punctuality, a strict byproduct of his military background. When he failed to clock in for his shift, his colleagues felt an immediate, sharp wave of unease. The floor foreman noted that his locker remained secured, his heavy steel-toed boots untouched. This was not a man who simply walked away from professional obligations. Back at his apartment, the scene was frozen in a state of suspended animation. Stacks of neatly taped cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled meticulously with a black marker. A rental agreement for a moving truck lay exposed on the kitchen counter, sitting next to a perfectly aligned pair of running shoes. He had systematically dismantled his life in Michigan, preparing for his impending departure to North Carolina. The relocation was entirely financed and firmly scheduled, yet the apartment was empty, the air stale and undisturbed. After 2 days of unanswered phone calls, escalating from mild, nagging concern to outright panic, his coworkers contacted local law enforcement to request a formal welfare check. The initial procedural steps yielded an unnerving discovery. Officers patrolling the periphery of the county located the missing man's vehicle sitting completely abandoned in a desolate park-and-ride lot in Bates Township, just a few miles east of the Caspian city limits. The dark-colored SUV was parked impeccably between the faded yellow lines, surrounded by empty asphalt. A thin, rigid layer of frost coated the windshield, indicating it had been sitting exposed to the plummeting temperatures for several nights. Investigators immediately cordoned off the lot and initiated a thorough external inspection. There was no shattered glass on the pavement, no dented quarter panels or broken taillights. Upon forcing entry into the cabin, the stillness inside deepened the mystery. The interior was absolutely spotless. The keys were missing from the ignition, and a sweep for biological evidence returned nothing. Forensics technicians dusted the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the door handles, discovering a chilling anomaly. The surfaces had been wiped completely clean. There were no latent fingerprints, not even the owner's. The vehicle looked entirely unremarkable, which is exactly what alarmed the responding detectives. It possessed the sterile, sanitized aura of a staged scene, a decoy left precisely where it would be easily found, deliberately designed to point the investigation away from the actual point of interception. News of the abandoned car cascaded through the neighboring communities of Caspian and Iron River with intense velocity. This was a microscopic geographical pocket where generational families recognized every passing vehicle, and anonymity was virtually impossible. A heavy, suffocating paranoia began to settle over the locals. The initial theories traded across diner counters and gas station pumps leaned toward voluntary disappearance, but those who actually knew the man aggressively dismantled that narrative. He had a solid pension, robust physical health, and a concrete exit strategy. He would not abandon his own vehicle in the freezing mud to start a new life on foot. The realization that a violent predator might be operating within their immediate radius fundamentally altered the local atmosphere. Hardware stores reported a sudden, massive surge in deadbolt and ammunition sales. Residents who had left their front doors unlocked for decades suddenly began securing their properties at dusk. The oppressive silence of the surrounding woods, usually a source of rustic pride, now felt distinctly hostile, harboring secrets the town was terrified to uncover. With a suspected homicide now framing the operation, law enforcement launched a massive, coordinated search effort. The jurisdiction fell heavily onto the shoulders of the local police chief, a seasoned investigator named Laura Frizzo, who immediately recognized the geographical nightmare ahead of her. The Ottawa National Forest wrapped around the decaying mining towns like a suffocating green ocean, offering nearly 1 million acres of untamed, brutal wilderness. Worse still, the region was dotted with hundreds of abandoned, flooded iron ore shafts, subterranean voids capable of hiding physical evidence forever. Search and rescue teams mobilized, establishing base camps along the tree line. Handlers brought in specialized cadaver dogs, sweeping the dense underbrush radiating outward from the park and ride lot. The canines strained against their harnesses, their noses pressed hard to the frozen dirt, but the scent trail simply ceased to exist. It evaporated at the exact edge of the asphalt, further confirming the theory that the victim had been transported in a secondary vehicle. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology chopped through the icy air above the canopy, scanning the jagged ravines and dense pine clusters for any biological heat signatures. Ground crews formed long, linear grids, pushing through thick briars and navigating treacherous, uneven terrain hidden beneath layers of decaying autumn foliage. But the elements were actively working against the investigation. As October bled into November, the notorious lake effect weather patterns asserted their absolute dominance. Heavy, blinding snowstorms buried the county under several feet of packed powder. The plummeting Fahrenheit readings froze the muddy topsoil into an impenetrable, concrete-like crust. Any disturbed earth, tire tracks, or stray fibers left behind by the perpetrators were systematically erased by the brutal northern winter. The landscape effectively sealed its own surface, locking away the truth beneath ice and snow. Weeks dragged on with agonizing slowness. The search grid was expanded, then expanded again, draining municipal resources and exhausting the dedicated volunteers. Specialized dive teams plunged into the freezing, murky waters of nearby lakes, feeling blindly along the silty bottoms, only to emerge empty-handed with lips blue from the extreme cold. The missing man had simply vanished into the geographic void, leaving behind nothing but a wiped-clean car and a packed apartment. Chief Frizzo and her detectives found themselves staring at an incident board completely devoid of actionable forensic leads. The physical search had hit a massive frozen wall. If the vast Michigan wilderness refused to surrender the victim, the investigators knew they had to drastically pivot their strategy. They needed to stop looking for a physical body and start searching for the psychological trigger that erased him. The investigation turned sharply inward, immediately plunging into a dark labyrinth of dead ends and frustrating red herrings that severely drained departmental morale. The initial heavy focus fell upon the veteran's romantic history. Detectives identified a former girlfriend residing in a neighboring county who possessed a highly contentious, volatile history with the missing man. Their past was defined by bitter, public arguments over shared finances and property disputes. Investigators spent 3 agonizing weeks tracking her daily movements, subpoenaing her cellular network records, and conducting aggressive, relentless interviews. She sat in the stark, concrete interrogation room, swearing she had not seen her ex-partner in over 6 months. Her voice cracked under the immense pressure, her hands trembling violently as she produced banking receipts and verified witness statements to solidify her whereabouts. Her alibi proved absolutely ironclad. The detectives had burned hundreds of man-hours chasing a phantom lead. The hyperactive rumor mill of the isolated mining community then offered a second, much darker theory. An anonymous, panicked informant suggested the victim had inadvertently crossed a local methamphetamine syndicate operating out of the rusted, dilapidated trailer parks bordering the tree line. This specific narrative consumed even more municipal resources. Undercover operations were rapidly authorized. Unmarked surveillance vans monitored suspected properties for days through the freezing rain. Warrants were executed, heavy wooden doors were kicked in by tactical teams, and local narcotics dealers were dragged into the station in handcuffs. The result was a profound, echoing silence. The missing man was completely clean. He possessed zero financial or social connections to the local drug trade. The investigation was hemorrhaging valuable time, chasing shadows in the snow while the true perpetrators sat quietly in their weathered house just a few miles down the road. Exhausted and thoroughly frustrated, the chief circled back to the very beginning. the heavy machinery manufacturing plant. Routine, secondary interviews with the deafening factory floor workers finally cracked the pristine, disciplined facade of the victim's life. Hesitant whispers of a clandestine, highly inappropriate relationship surfaced among the machinists. The robust, military-trained veteran had been engaged in a deeply toxic affair with a married woman from the assembly line. The suspect was immediately brought into the local precinct. This was not a standard procedural interview. It was an intense, high-stakes psychological war. Placed in a sterile, windowless room, she did not exhibit the typical frantic anxiety or defensive posture of a cornered criminal. Instead, she was entirely relaxed, almost profoundly bored by the process. She leaned back in the rigid metal chair, offering the veteran detectives a faint, deeply condescending smile. When directly questioned about her relationship with the missing man, she freely admitted to the sexual affair without a fraction of hesitation or shame. She calmly stated it was purely physical, a meaningless, temporary distraction from her own suffocating, pathetic marriage. She claimed her husband knew absolutely everything about the infidelity and had fully accepted the humiliating arrangement. The chief pressed much harder, leaning closely across the scratched metal table, demanding to know exactly where the victim had gone on the night of October 14th. The suspect feigned a brilliant, wide-eyed ignorance. She smoothly suggested that he had likely just left for his planned relocation to Asheville, North Carolina, a few days early to escape mounting local debts and personal responsibilities. She spun intricate, highly plausible lies, wrapping every deception in a thick, impenetrable veneer of complete cooperation. She offered her mobile device for data extraction. She voluntarily offered her fingerprints. She was executing a flawless, rehearsed performance, treating the seasoned investigators like amateur participants in her personal, twisted game. Despite her unshakable confidence, the circumstantial pressure on the couple was mounting rapidly. Law enforcement secured a strict judicial warrant to officially search the weathered property in Caspian. The forensic sweep of the residence yielded deeply unsettling, contradictory results. The upstairs living quarters were heavily cluttered, dusty, and thoroughly lived in, but the subterranean level was a jarring anomaly. The basement had been chemically sanitized to a severe industrial degree. The absolute absence of typical dirt, coupled with the lingering, overpowering scent of heavy degreasers and concentrated bleach burning the investigators' sinuses, raised massive red flags for the evidence technicians. However, aggressive household cleaning is not a statutory crime. Without a physical body, without a recovered murder weapon, and without a single drop of biological evidence, the detectives were legally forced to leave the property empty-handed. Sensing the rapidly closing net and the relentless daily scrutiny of the local police force, the suspects realized their isolated sanctuary had been fully compromised. They abandoned the Upper Peninsula entirely. Packing their vehicle in the dead of night, they fled hundreds of miles south, retreating to the familiar, sprawling industrial landscape of their home state of Indiana. They falsely believed that sheer distance and crossing jurisdictional lines would sever the investigation permanently. They severely underestimated the chief, who refused to drop the cold case, coordinating daily with out-of-state federal agencies to digitally monitor their financial movements. Back in the industrial decay of Indiana, the internal dynamic of the lethal marriage fractured completely. The psychological weight of the mechanical slaughter in the basement fundamentally broke the husband. His chronic radiating back pain intensified dramatically, rendering him entirely immune to his standard medication. His paranoia spiked to uncontrollable manic levels. His physical weight plummeted. He stopped leaving their new residence altogether, prone to sudden, violent sobbing fits and erratic, unpredictable behavior. For the cold, calculating architect of the death pact, a crumbling, mentally unstable accomplice was an unacceptable liability. He had served his ultimate purpose by pulling the trigger. Now, he was merely a dangerous, ticking loose end, threatening her total freedom. On February 20th, 2016, emergency dispatchers responded to a frantic, breathless 911 call from a quiet residence in Hobart, Indiana. The caller was the wife. She hysterically reported that her husband was entirely unresponsive, claiming he had accidentally ingested a massive, fatal overdose of his prescribed painkillers. First responders rushed into the home, finding the man dead on the living room carpet. The initial superficial medical ruling pointed directly toward an accidental overdose, a tragically common, entirely unremarkable conclusion in the opioid-ravaged regions of the Midwest. But the subsequent, detailed medical autopsy ripped that convenient narrative apart. The comprehensive toxicology report revealed a massive, lethal dose of pure heroin, a highly specific, street-level narcotic the deceased man had absolutely no medical or social history of using. Furthermore, the medical examiner discovered deep, unnatural, localized bruising around his neck and severely crushed cartilage in his throat. The mechanical reality of his death was brutally, undeniably clear. He had been intentionally poisoned to rapidly incapacitate his central nervous system, and as his failing body instinctively struggled for oxygen, he was violently, manually suffocated. The architect had activated her lethal protocol for the second time, but this arrogant, remarkably sloppy execution provided the exact catalyst the frustrated authorities desperately needed. The brazen murder of the husband instantly blew the stagnant Michigan disappearance case wide open. The careful facade of the grieving, victimized widow evaporated immediately in the cold light of the autopsy room. The lead investigator finally possessed the concrete, physical leverage required to tear the entire labyrinth of manipulation down to the ground. The undeniable reality of the autopsy report obliterated the widow's carefully constructed illusion. Knowing federal task forces were rapidly closing in, she fled Indiana. The desperate flight was short-lived. In late April 2016, authorities tracked her digital footprint to Wingo, Kentucky, a tiny rural community over 300 miles south. United States Marshals quickly surrounded the perimeter and executed the arrest without incident. Inside the sterile interrogation room, her meticulously maintained psychological facade completely fractured. Her demeanor became wildly erratic, oscillating abruptly between hysterical sobbing and hollow, detached laughter. She eventually outlined the gruesome, mechanical logistics of the Michigan basement slaughter, attempting to shift the primary blame onto her dead husband. However, she freely confessed to the lethal heroin dose and the manual suffocation in Hobart. She coldly told the investigators she eliminated her spouse out of revenge for her lover's death, a profoundly twisted justification for erasing the very man who had blindly executed her initial command. The legal consequences were swift and divided across two state jurisdictions. In 2017, a Michigan jury convicted her of first-degree murder for the factory worker's execution and dismemberment, resulting in a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The following year, Indiana prosecutors secured a guilty plea for the domestic homicide of her husband, adding a consecutive 65-year sentence to her permanent record. The concrete walls of a maximum security facility finally contained the architect of the carnage. The weathered house in Caspian stands empty today, a silent, rotting monument to a union permanently forged in blood. The promise made on that wedding night was never a symptom of devotion. It was the ultimate architecture of absolute control. The architect now sits indefinitely behind concrete walls, entirely stripped of her psychological leverage. Some vows are designed to protect the fragile bonds of marriage, but the covenant sealed in that freezing Michigan basement was built exclusively to destroy. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.